Okay, so get this right. Today we're going to do a deep dive into ancient mysteries and lost
Oh,
civilizations.
cool.
Yeah, and maybe even like a cataclysmic event that like totally reshaped the world.
Wow.
Yeah, we've got some excerpts about Graham Hancock's research and Randall Carlson,
Okay.
and some really interesting stuff about Atlantis and all those flood myths that you find like everywhere.
It's not just like how many flood myths there are that's so interesting,
Right.
but it's like the fact that they're found in cultures all over the planet.
It's true.
Yeah.
It makes you
Yeah.
wonder,
Yeah.
like,
Is it just a coincidence?
right, like, yeah, we all know the story of Noah's Ark.
Right.
But there are versions of a great flood in pretty much every culture.
Exactly.
Makes you wonder if it's, if it's more than just a coincidence.
It really does.
Yeah.
And what's really fascinating is that some researchers, like Randall Carlson,
Oh, yeah?
actually use geological data
You okay?
to suggest that maybe a massive flood actually happened and changed the Earth's landscape.
He uses the Grand Canyon as an example, right?
Yes.
He challenges that whole idea that it formed slowly over millions of years.
Right.
What if, like, a massive flood carved it out way faster?
Exactly. He points to like the canyon's steep walls
Okay.
and those huge boulders
Yeah.
scattered around, saying they point to like a very sudden, powerful event,
Right.
not slow erosion over time.
Right.
It's a pretty bold claim that really kind of shakes up how we usually think about geology.
So we've got these like widespread flood myths,
Right.
and we've got this geologist saying that a massive flood might explain some things.
Yeah.
And then we bring in Graham Hancock, who takes it a step further
Right.
with his theory about a technologically advanced civilization that got wiped out around 12,900 years ago,
Okay.
possibly by a comet impact.
Now, what's really interesting here
Okay.
is that 12,900 years ago is also around the time that Plato claimed Atlantis was destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
And it coincides with what's called the Younger Dryas, which was this really sudden cold snap that interrupted the warming after the last ice age.
Hold on, so we've got flood myths,
Uh-huh.
maybe a real flood,
Yeah.
a lost civilization,
Yeah.
and a comet impact,
Right.
all happening around the same time.
Yeah.
This is getting crazy.
It's a lot to take in.
Yeah.
But we have to acknowledge here that mainstream archaeologists and historians
Okay.
are incredibly skeptical of Hancock's theories.
Okay.
They view it as what's called pseudo-archaeology
Yeah.
and pseudo-history.
Okay, but what does that actually mean? What are they criticizing specifically?
Well, they argue that Hancock doesn't really build his theories from the evidence.
Hmm.
They say that he starts with a conclusion and then selects the evidence to fit,
Right.
instead of letting the evidence lead him to a conclusion.
So he's picking and choosing
Kind of, yeah.
what supports his ideas.
Yeah.
And ignoring the things that don't.
Right.
It seems like a pretty big problem if you're trying to be objective.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like deciding that aliens built the pyramids and then only focusing on evidence that sort of supports that idea
Right.
while ignoring all the evidence that points to humans building them.
Right.
You see what I mean?
Okay, so that's Hancock.
Yeah.
But what about Atlantis?
Right.
Is it just a story that Plato made up, or could there be some truth to it?
Well, most academics believe that Atlantis was an allegory.
Okay.
Plato was really into exploring ideal forms of government
Right.
and the dangers of society becoming corrupt and greedy.
Hmm.
So they see Atlantis as this kind of cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power.
That makes sense.
Kind of like his story of the Ring of Gauges.
Yeah, yeah.
He was really into those kind of stories.
Right. He was definitely into like big ideas about justice and how
Yeah.
society should be run.
Absolutely.
But then some people believe that maybe Plato based the Atlantis story on real events,
Oh,
like the Athenian invasion of Sicily, which failed disastrously,
Right.
or the destruction of the Greek city of Helike by an earthquake and tsunami. So there are other possibilities.
There are.
And while we know that Plato wrote about Atlantis,
Yeah.
that whole idea that he heard the story from his ancestor Solon,
Right.
who in turn got it from an Egyptian priest,
Right.
is shaky at best.
Yeah, very shaky.
The sources confirm that Plato wrote it,
Yeah.
but not how he came up with the story.
Right, exactly.
So we've got this legendary lost city,
Uh-huh.
possible catastrophic floods,
Yeah.
and these like conflicting opinions from experts. It's
Wait.
like we're trying to put together a puzzle, but half the pieces are missing and there's no picture on the box.
Yeah, and it raises some really important questions like,
Oh, yeah.
how do we evaluate evidence from so long ago,
Right.
especially when it's so fragmented and open to interpretation?
It's tough.
And how do we separate fact from fiction?
Those are some tough questions.
Those are tough questions.
And that's exactly what makes, like, diving into these ancient mysteries so fascinating.
It is.
But I think we need to unpack Randall Carlson's ideas a little more.
Okay, good idea. Let's revisit that Grand Canyon mystery and look closer at his evidence.
Sounds good.
Okay. Welcome back. Glad to be continuing this deep dive with you.
Absolutely. Last time we were talking about those criticisms of Graham Hancock.
Right?
But I'm really curious to get back to Randall Carlson
Okay.
and his geological evidence. You know,
Yeah.
you mentioned that he uses the Grand Canyon
Uh-huh.
to support this idea of a massive flood.
Right.
Can you tell us a little more about that?
Sure. So Carlson points to features of the Grand Canyon,
Okay.
like, it's incredibly steep walls,
Right.
and those massive boulders you see scattered around
Uh-huh.
as evidence that it was formed suddenly by a powerful event.
Okay.
He thinks that these features are much more consistent with like a huge flood
Okay.
than with slow erosion over millions of years,
Right.
which is the standard explanation.
I'm trying to picture this.
Yeah.
How could a flood be powerful enough to cart out something as gigantic as the Grand Canyon?
Well, Carlson believes it would have taken like a combination of factors.
Yeah.
He talks about massive amounts of glacial meltwater,
Right.
maybe combined with rainfall, unlike anything that we see today,
Oh.
and possibly even a sudden release of water from underground sources.
Okay.
Like imagine a colossal wall of water
Okay.
carrying tons of sediment and debris,
Right.
just surging through the landscape with incredible force.
I can see why that would get people's attention. It's
Yeah.
definitely a different way of looking at things.
It is.
But I also remember you said that mainstream scientists are skeptical.
Yeah, they are.
Why is that?
Well, mainstream geologists say that the evidence points to the Grand Canyon being formed
Okay.
gradually over millions of years by the Colorado River.
Right.
They argue that the kinds of features Carlson points to can be explained by processes we see happening today,
Okay.
just over a much longer period.
So it's like a clash between two different interpretations of the evidence.
Exactly.
One says, like, slow and steady wins the race. Yeah.
And the other one says it was a sudden dramatic event.
Right. It's a great example of how scientific ideas can be debated
Yeah.
and how evidence can be interpreted in different ways.
Okay, so we've got these flood myths that are found all over the world,
Uh-huh.
and we've got a geologist saying that a massive flood could explain some things
Right.
about the Earth's landscape.
Yeah.
But if such a flood really happened, wouldn't there be more physical evidence?
Well, that's a question a lot of people have.
Yeah.
And Carlson argues that there is evidence of a catastrophic flood
Yeah.
in the geological record.
Where?
Well, he points to things like erosion patterns that cover vast areas. Those huge boulders we talked about before that seem to have been moved great distances
Right.
by unimaginable forces.
Okay.
And layers of sediment that suggest that material was deposited rapidly,
Right.
not slowly over time.
So he's saying these features are like fingerprints left behind by this massive flood.
Exactly. He's trying to connect those ancient flood myths
With the geological record.
This is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
He's not just looking at geology or mythology in isolation.
Right.
He's trying to see how they might fit together.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what's so fascinating about his approach.
Yeah.
He's not afraid to kind of cross those traditional boundaries between disciplines.
Now, even if we imagine that this giant flood happened,
Yeah.
what could have caused something that massive?
Well, Carlson, along with other researchers like Graham Hancock, points to the Younger Dryas.
Okay.
Remember we talked about that period of rapid climate change around 12,900 years ago?
Right, the sudden cold snap that interrupted the warming after the last ice age.
Exactly.
You said that time period lines up with the possible destruction of Atlantis, too.
Yeah, it does. And with Hancock's proposed date for the demise of a lost civilization.
It's very interesting.
Yeah, the timing is really interesting, to say the least.
Yeah.
So the Earth was coming out of the Ice Age. Things were warming up.
Okay.
And then suddenly the planet plunged back into like a near glacial state
Wow.
for about 1,000 years.
That's a long time.
Yeah, it was a huge shift that must have had like a major impact on everything.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah.
So what caused that sudden deep freeze?
Well, that's what scientists are still trying to figure out.
Okay.
But one of the leading theories is that a comet impact, or maybe a comet exploding in the atmosphere,
Okay.
triggered the Younger Dryas.
Wow.
The idea is that this event caused massive wildfires,
Okay.
melted glaciers incredibly fast,
Yeah.
and threw up huge amounts of dust and debris into the atmosphere,
Right.
blocking out the sun and leading to that sudden cooling.
Whoa, that's a pretty intense scenario.
It is.
Is there any actual evidence for this impact theory?
There is some interesting evidence, but it's still being studied.
Okay.
For example, researchers have found sediment layers dating back to the Younger Dryas
Okay.
that contain things like nanodiamonds.
Nanodiamonds.
Yeah, tiny little diamonds, and melted glass-like materials,
Wow.
and other unusual particles that could have been created by the intense heat and pressure
Right.
of an impact event.
So let me get this straight. We've got this sudden climate change, the Younger Dryas, possibly caused by a comet impact.
Right.
We've also got these ancient flood myths from all over the world.
Yeah.
And CARLSON thinks a massive flood might explain certain features we see in the Earth's landscape.
Right.
Are all these things connected somehow?
Well, that's exactly what CARLSON and HANCOCK believe. Their theory goes like this.
Okay.
The comet impact or airburst triggered the Younger Dryas,
Okay.
which caused a rapid melting of glaciers, leading to those catastrophic floods.
Right.
And those floods then reshaped the Earth's surface,
Wow.
and they believe wiped out entire civilizations.
That's a pretty dramatic story.
It is.
It sounds like a disaster movie.
It does.
But you're right, it's still just a theory.
It is.
And it's very controversial.
Very controversial. Yeah, mainstream scientists have serious doubts about the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis.
Right.
And a lot of archaeologists and historians just don't buy the idea that a global flood wiped out advanced civilizations. They say the evidence just isn't there.
So where does that leave us?
It sounds like there's a lot of debate about all of this.
There is.
Yeah.
And that's part of what makes exploring these topics so fascinating.
Right.
You know, we're dealing with a puzzle from the distant past. And it's a puzzle with a lot of missing pieces.
Yeah.
Some things seem to fit together, but other things don't.
Yeah.
And it's up to each of us to kind of weigh the evidence and decide what we find convincing.
I like that.
Yeah.
It means that, like, we get to be active participants in this process of discovery.
Right.
We're not just being told what to think.
Exactly.
We're being invited to think for ourselves.
Exactly. That's what makes it so rewarding.
Yeah.
You know, it's not about finding a definitive answer.
Right.
It's about asking questions and exploring different possibilities.
I like that. And speaking of exploring possibilities,
Okay.
I think it's time we delve into the legend of Atlantis.
Okay, that's a great transition.
Yeah.
We talked about flood myths and possible floods.
Right.
And now we're getting into a story about a civilization
Yeah.
that was supposedly swallowed by the sea.
Right. The story of Atlantis, whether it's fact or fiction,
Yeah.
touches on a lot of the themes we've been discussing.
So we know that Plato wrote about Atlantis.
Right.
But can you remind us what he actually said?
Sure. According to Plato, Atlantis was a powerful island nation
Okay.
located beyond the Pillars of Hercules,
Right.
which is generally thought to refer to the Strait of Gibraltar.
Okay.
He describes it as a technologically advanced and culturally sophisticated civilization
Wow.
with enormous wealth and military power.
Sounds like a pretty impressive place.
Yeah, that's how Plato portrays it, at least initially.
Okay.
He talks about grand palaces and temples
Right.
and a sophisticated network of canals and waterways.
Really?
Yeah, very advanced. But then he says the Atlanteans became arrogant and greedy.
Oh, I see where this is going. Pride comes before a fall, as they say.
Exactly. And that's when things take a turn for the worse.
Uh-oh.
Plato describes this cataclysmic event.
Okay.
Earthquakes, floods, volcanic eruptions,
Wow.
all happening at once.
Really?
Yeah, it must have been terrifying.
Oh, I bet.
That sank Atlantis beneath the ocean in a single day and night.
That's a dramatic end, to say the least.
Yeah, it is.
But is there any evidence to support Plato's story?
That's where things get a little tricky.
Oh.
Despite centuries of people searching for Atlantis, no one has ever found any conclusive archaeological evidence
Wow.
that it actually existed.
Really? No.
Nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing conclusive. And that's led a lot of scholars to believe that Plato's story
Right.
was a fictional allegory.
So they think that he was using Atlantis to make a point
Right.
about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of virtue.
Exactly. They argue that Plato was using the story to illustrate
Right.
his philosophical ideas about ideal societies and how power can corrupt.
That makes sense. Plato was all about those big questions about justice, wisdom, and the good life.
Exactly. He was.
Yeah.
But even if we say that Atlantis was a made-up story,
Okay.
it doesn't mean that the story itself isn't powerful.
Right.
The legend of Atlantis has captured people's imaginations for centuries.
It's true.
It's inspired countless books, movies, works of art.
Yeah.
It's amazing how much this story has resonated with people.
It really is. It speaks to, like, our fascination with lost civilizations.
Yeah.
And ancient mysteries.
Uh-huh.
And maybe even to, like, a longing for some kind of lost paradise.
It's interesting that you mentioned a lost paradise.
Yeah.
Because that idea of a golden age lost to disaster is a theme that pops up in myths and legend all over the world.
You're right. It seems like there's this, like, deep human need to believe that something better existed in the past.
Yeah.
And that maybe we've, like, lost our way somehow.
It's a compelling idea.
It is.
But I think it's important to remember that we can learn from the past.
Oh, right.
Even if we can't go back to it.
Right.
The stories we tell about lost civilizations can teach us about ourselves.
Okay.
About the dangers of hubris.
Yeah.
And about the importance of preserving knowledge and wisdom.
I like that perspective.
Yeah.
It's not about, like, dwelling on what might have been.
Right.
It's about learning from the past and applying those lessons to the present.
Exactly. And on that note, I think it's a good place to pause for now.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dive.
We have. We've gone from the Grand Canyon to the Younger Dryas to the legend of Atlantis.
Right.
It's amazing how these ideas all seem to connect to each other.
Yeah, it really is. And I think it highlights how much we still don't know about the past.
Right.
There's still so many mysteries to uncover.
Absolutely.
So many stories waiting to be told.
And that's what makes this so exciting.
Yeah.
Who knows what we might discover next?
Stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive. Okay. Where we'll explore even more thought-provoking questions.
Great.
About ancient cataclysms and the possibility of lost civilizations.
Can't wait.
We'll be back soon.
Welcome back, deep divers. Ready for the final part of our exploration?
Absolutely. We've been through flood myths, geological mysteries, and even dove into the legend of Atlantis.
Through all this talk about catastrophic events and lost civilizations, one question keeps popping up for me. If a technologically advanced civilization really existed way back when, what happened to all the evidence? Why don't we see more of it?
That's the big challenge for anyone who believes in lost civilizations.
Right.
It's a question that's hard to ignore.
I mean, imagine a civilization like Atlantis with all that technology and grand architecture.
Yeah.
You'd think we'd find remnants of their cities, their inventions, their art.
You would.
Wouldn't there be more than just stories and legends?
You think so, right. But those who believe in lost civilizations have some explanations.
Okay, I'm curious. What are some of their ideas?
Well, one argument is that the cataclysmic event that wiped them out, whether it was a flood, a comet impact, or something else, was so devastating that it erased almost all traces of their existence. Picture cities collapsing, being swept away by tsunamis or buried under miles of sediment.
I can see how that would make finding anything incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
It'd be like searching for a needle in a haystack, but the haystack has been blown to smithereens.
Exactly. And if the event involved rising sea levels, as many of those flood myths suggest, then a lot of potential evidence could be sitting at the bottom of the ocean.
That makes things even more challenging.
It does.
Underwater archaeology is tough enough as it is.
Right.
Let alone trying to find traces of a lost civilization thousands of years old.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge.
It does make you wonder what else might be hidden down there.
Yeah.
But okay, so maybe the evidence was destroyed or is underwater. What other explanations are there?
Another idea is that we might be looking in the wrong places, or maybe we're looking right at the evidence, but not recognizing it for what it is. Some researchers believe that certain ancient structures, like the pyramids of Egypt or those megalithic temples in Malta, show a level of technological sophistication that's hard to explain with our current understanding of those cultures.
So they're suggesting that these structures might be the work of a lost civilization.
Yeah.
Or at least built using knowledge passed down from them. Kind of like inheriting blueprints from a long-lost ancestor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They argue that we need to be more open-minded about the capabilities of ancient cultures. Maybe they had knowledge and technologies that we've forgotten about or haven't rediscovered yet.
That's a fascinating thought.
It is.
It really challenges us to rethink what we think we know about history.
It does.
But let's flip this around for a second.
Okay.
And play devil's advocate.
Okay.
If a civilization was advanced enough to build things like the pyramids,
wouldn't they have left behind more obvious, longer-lasting evidence?
You would think.
Wouldn't we find more advanced tools, machines, or written records that somehow survived?
That's the argument that a lot of skeptics make.
Yeah.
They say, if a civilization was that sophisticated,
Yeah.
there should be more concrete, undeniable proof.
It seems like a fair point.
Yeah?
I mean, we found ancient Roman and Greek tools and structures,
Right.
pottery from prehistoric cultures,
Yeah.
even dinosaur bones. You'd think a really advanced civilization would have left more behind that could survive for thousands of years.
It's a good question. And to be honest, those who believe in lost civilizations haven't always come up with satisfying answers.
Yeah.
Some say that maybe those civilizations used materials that decomposed or eroded over time,
Right.
leaving no trace. Others suggest that maybe the evidence is hidden in plain sight,
Okay.
but we're misinterpreting it or assuming it came from a later culture.
So it sounds like we're in this gray area where there are intriguing ideas, but not a lot of definitive answers. But I guess that's part of what makes this whole subject so interesting, right?
Absolutely. It's all about embracing the mystery and continuing to explore, to ask questions, and to be open to new discoveries.
Right.
Maybe someday we'll find that breakthrough piece of evidence that solves the puzzle.
Until then, we'll keep diving deep and pondering the possibilities.
Exactly.
And hey, maybe one of our listeners will be the one to make that incredible discovery that changes everything.
Wouldn't that be amazing? It would be a real testament to the power of curiosity and our desire to understand our past.
I think it's time we surface from this deep dive.
Okay.
But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with a thought.
Okay.
If a cataclysmic event did reshape our world way back when, what other secrets are still out there, buried beneath the surface waiting to be found?
It's a question that should keep us all exploring, keep us questioning, and keep our minds open.
Right.
To the mysteries that are still hidden in the depths of time. Well said. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey, Deep Divers.
It's been great.
Keep those minds curious, and we'll see you next time.